Wes, if I was running low on fuel, could you fly some up to me? Well, hold my beer, Wes said. Or something like that anyway. This was 1921 after all. We just do it like we always do. The usual Barnstormer Wingwalker show. Earl, you fly up real close to Frank's plane, and I'll just climb over from his wing to yours, except that I'll have a gas can strapped to my back instead of my parachute. Then I just pour it into your tank. What could possibly go wrong? Believe it or not, that's how aerial refueling was invented. Not by the military, not by a group of engineers, or by an aircraft company, but by 3 everyday pilot guys sitting around over beers and talking. What followed nearly ended in disaster. Not only that, their high-flying antics inspired the military to try its own hand at it. The names of those 3 men were Wesley May, Frank Hawks, and Earl Dougherty, and these days they're forgotten pioneers in aviation history. Today, military planes can fly halfway around the world to reach a target. On the way, they might link up with a tanker and refuel a half-dozen times. Doing it safely requires years of training, practice, and lots of skill in formation flying. It also requires specialized equipment. But back in 1921, when Wes, Frank, and Earl hatched up their crazy idea, they had none of that. They weren't military pilots either. They were just typical Americans. For them, the idea of aerial refueling was just a new airshow trick. They thought they could amaze the crowds on weekends as they flew from town to town across America, performing and giving rides. Between them, they had 2 planes. Frank's was a Lincoln Standard biplane. Earl's was a Curtiss Jenny. The Curtiss Jenny, by the way, is one of the most iconic barnstorming planes in American history. It was perfect for wing walkers because the lower wing featured a wooden loop skid at each wingtip. But those same skids doubled as handholds for Wes. He would grab onto them, let go of Frank's plane, and then pull himself onto Earl's wing. The crowds always loved it, and he was an expert and had done it dozens of times. The 3 men hired a 3rd plane and pilot to carry a cameraman along and take photographs. They wanted to have proof that they had done it. Down at the airport, Wes filled up a 5-gallon can of gas, and he had rigged up a set of straps so that he could carry it on his back. He then practiced taking it off while seated in the cockpit. He also practiced standing up, leaning over the windscreen, unscrewing the plane's gas cap, which just happened to be conveniently located just in front of his seat, and pouring the gas in. He practiced reattaching the gas cap, sitting back down, putting the empty gas can on the floor, and job done. It all seemed easy enough. They were ready to fly. When all 3 planes were pushed out by the side of the runway, Wes climbed into the front cockpit of Frank's Lincoln Standard biplane. Earl would take off in his Curtiss Jenny alone, though he'd land with Wes in the front cockpit. The chase plane with the hired photographer took off last behind them. The 3 planes then circled up together to 1,000 feet of altitude. It was a beautiful day to fly. Wes climbed out onto the lower right wing. He worked his way out toward the wingtip, taking care, as always, to step only on the main wing spar. The wind was roaring past at about 60 miles per hour, about the slowest that Frank could safely fly. With Wes gripping onto the wing wires and the strut at the wingtip, Frank had the stick hard over to the left to counterbalance his weight. Earl then flew in close, positioning himself just above Frank's wingtip, with only a few feet separating the 2 planes. This was skilled flying, and if they were sloppy, they might collide and end up in a crash. As Earl eased in closer, Wes reached up and grabbed onto the skid. First with one hand, then with the other, and with that, he was free of Frank's plane. The 2 pilots then eased their planes back apart. Wes was dangling under the Curtiss Jenny's left wing, holding on with both hands as the wind blew him around. Usually he could flip his legs up onto the lower wing and climb over to the Jenny's front cockpit from there. But suddenly, it wasn't so easy anymore. The weight of the gas can, filled to the top with fuel, meant that he had to lift not only himself, but an extra 35 pounds onto the lower wing. Imagine doing chin-ups with that kind of weight strapped to your back while you ride down the highway in a pickup truck at full speed. Then you can imagine what he was up against. He had no choice, however. He had to pull himself up. Frank couldn't land with him hanging under the wing like that, and as well, he couldn't just let go because he had swapped his parachute for the gas can. It was literally do or die. So with near superhuman effort, he pulled himself up finally onto the wing. He stopped there for a few moments of rest, then he stood up. As usual, holding onto the struts and wires, he worked his way toward the front cockpit of Earl's plane. Then, when he tried to climb in, the gas can got in his way. After a few tries, he finally slid into the seat and carefully removed it from his back. He placed the gas can on the cockpit floor first and took a few breaths. There was no strapping in yet, however. He still had to pour the gas into the plane's fuel tank. When he had practiced it on the ground, this was the easy part. You just stood up, removed the cap, and poured the gas in. Once flying, however, things got more complicated. Earl flew straight and perfectly level, and Wes stood up to lean over the windshield to take off the gas cap. He found that he had to hold on most of the time with one hand or risk being blown out of the plane. He sat back down in the cockpit and stowed it in his pocket. Then he reached down and picked up the gas can from the cockpit floor, putting it up onto his lap. He carefully unscrewed the cap and put on the spout. Once again, he nodded to Earl, then stood back up in the cockpit. It was then that he first realized that the exhaust pipes from the Jenny's big inline engine were belching out flames just a few feet away. Pouring the fuel into the tank looked like it was going to be a little more dangerous than he'd thought. He grabbed a hold of the top wing with one hand, then lifted the 35-pound gas can over the front of the windscreen, leaned forward, and with just one hand, he tried to tip the gas can forward and line up the spout so it fit into the fuel tank. This proved to be no easy task, as the plane was flying along at 60 miles per hour. Every time he tipped the can, gasoline sprayed back onto his chest and neck as it siphoned off into the slipstream from the force of the wind. He tried again and again, and each time more gas sprayed off, coating the windshield, covering the top of the fuselage, and even spraying back onto the rear cockpit where Earl was flying. Thankfully, Earl was wearing his goggles that day. All the while, the exhaust pipes on the engine belched out flames close by. If he wasn't careful, the spilled gas would ignite, and they'd die in a fiery crash. He wasn't about to quit, however. History had to be made. Finally, he got the spout lined up, and he pushed it deep down into the tank to ensure that the wind didn't siphon off any more of the fuel. The can poured itself out, emptying what remained of the gas into the Curtiss Jenny's fuel tank. When it was empty, he pulled the spout back out and sat down in the cockpit, putting the gas can again on his lap. Then he removed the spout and screwed the cap back onto the gas can before putting it on the cockpit floor. A third time, he stood back up and leaned over the windscreen. He still had to reattach the cap onto the airplane's fuel tank, and once done, he sat back down and finally strapped himself in. He had done it. Despite the gasoline spraying everywhere, the plane hadn't caught fire. He glanced back at the photographer in the chase plane, hoping that the photos would come out. The three planes circled back to the airfield and made a routine landing. What had sounded easy over beers was anything but once they were in the air. The whole thing took so long that Earl's plane had burned more gas than they had even been able to add to the tank. Still, they had done it. It was nearly 2 years later before the U.S. Army Air Corps tried air-to-air refueling for their first time. Having seen photos of Wes climbing from one plane to the other and realizing the absurdity of that, the Army tried a hose system instead. At Rockwell Field in San Diego, California, they modified a pair of Airco DH-4B biplanes for the job. Even with the hose system, the Army pilots ran into some unexpected problems. When they dangled a hose from one plane down to the other, it flapped around so much that it was nearly impossible for the backseat observer to grab onto it. After many more trials, some modifications, and a lot of practice, the Army finally got it right. On June 27, 1923, First Lieutenant Virgil Hine and First Lieutenant Frank Seifert reeled out the refueling hose. The second plane was flown by Captain Lowell Smith, and Lieutenant John Richter was in the back. He grabbed onto the hose, connected it to the fuel tank, and signaled to pour in the fuel. It worked a lot better, but it still wasn't much more than a PR stunt. Also in 1923, the Royal Flying Corps in England and the French Armée de l'Air successfully flew their own first air-to-air refueling efforts. All of that is usually forgotten when people talk about the history of aerial refueling. Most people think things got started with an Army Air Corps plane, a modified Atlantic Fokker C-2A that was nicknamed ? That happened 6 years later, however. The real heroes were Wes, Frank, and Earl, 3 everyday Americans who just had a good idea one day down at the bar. Hold my beer indeed. I'm Thomas Van Hare, and this is Historic Wings. Please subscribe and consider supporting us. And remember, there's always more to the story.